Counting Crows burst onto the music scene in the early 90s with their debut record that blew up much to the band's surprise. Counting Crows fought tooth and nail to get what they wanted, not compromising along the way. The intent was to have a debut record that was a slow burn, but the whole strategy backfired when a year later, Counting Crows were one of the biggest selling artists of the year. Today, let's discuss how the band got so big so quickly. Born in Baltimore, frontman Adam Duritz's father was a doctor, a pediatrician who studied the effects of alcohol on pregnancy. Duritz's family moved a lot because of his father's medical school, his residency, and a short army stint, residing in several cities including Boston, El Paso, Denver, as well as Houston before settling in Berkeley, California. Duritz remarked to Spin, "I don't have any real roots." His lack of roots played a huge part in shaping the lyrics behind Counting Crows' debut record, something we'll talk more about in a bit. Duritz was exposed to Jackson 5 and Barry Manilow growing up, and in the 7th grade, his dad took him to see ELO at the Oakland Coliseum, further boosting his interest in music. This, coupled with listening to funk groups like the Ohio Players and his father's collection of folk records, and Duritz had a pretty eclectic education in music. He was soon singing Kisses Beth to girls at Hebrew school and Led Zeppelin's Black Dog at bar mitzvahs. By the late 80s, Duritz was enrolled in Berkeley studying English, and he soon started to write music. But this period in his life was a particularly rough time. He was dealing with mental health issues that were only exacerbated by drinking and drugs, mostly pot and hallucinogens, remarking to Rolling Stone that he had one very bad acid trip that lasted a long time, adding, "And somehow my mind learned to duplicate it. It's a very bad thing when you start having acid trips without taking acid." Later on in his career, he talked about dealing with depersonalization disorder. By 1989, he dropped out of Berkeley and hopped on a plane to Europe, remarking, "I jumped on a plane and told myself that I'd never come back unless I was with a band. I was kind of drifting back then." He added, "To say that I was in bad shape would be putting it very, very nicely." It was during his trip in Europe he met an Australian woman on the Greek island of Corfu, but they eventually broke up, realizing their relationship had no future. She'd later go on to be the inspiration behind the song Anna Begins on the Counting Crows debut record. Eventually, Duritz made his way back home and tried to straighten out his life, thanks to his parents and a doctor. Upon returning home, he was sharing a space with Camper Van Beethoven member David Immergluck, and at the insistence of his roommate, Duritz answered an ad in the paper, which got him a gig in the band The Himalayans, which also featured bassist Marty Jones, who is the Mr. Jones, something we'll talk about a little bit later. Duritz was also playing in 2 other bands at this point in time, including Sordid Humor, which was an REM-influenced group, but it became clear that none of the outfits he was playing in were poised to have any success. Duritz soon grew frustrated with his prospects as a musician, as it didn't seem like he was going anywhere in life, recalling to Rolling Stone. "All I knew how to do was write songs and play them in clubs, but I never had any interest in anything I did, and I could see what I was doing wasn't very good in a lot of ways. I've always been self-destructive, and I thought this was the ultimate in self-destruction, building an impossible life for myself." But that was about to change. Duritz soon met guitarist David Bryson through a mutual friend. Bryson owned a 16-track recording studio called Dancing Dog in Emeryville, California. Bryson, up until this point, had helped local bands record demos for nearly a decade, and he was previously in a band called Mr. Dog, and even had a label deal 6 years prior, but their frontman abandoned the project and joined a cult, and of course the deal fell through. Duritz and Bryson's relationship eventually gave birth to Counting Crows by 1991. The pair did some acoustic shows in and around Berkeley and San Francisco. They took their name from a British nursery rhyme that Duritz heard in the film Signs of Life.
And then I was at home, it had come out on videotape, and I happened to be in my parents' house making a list of band names, all of which were terrible. I had like 2 columns on one of those.
Just an example of 1 or 2.
Oh, this is where it gets messed up. I only remember like Bird Circle and Monkey Garden.
Ooh,
Those are the only two names I had. And I had to name the band, you know. I
So
really
you
needed
liked
to name-
animals, obviously.
I was just trying. It was like REM song names or something. And then I'm watching the movie at the same time, and all of a sudden Vince says that, and I thought, oh, Counting Crows, that's a great name.
It stuck.
And everyone hated it. The record label's like, please change the name of your band. I'm like, no, all names are stupid in your band until you succeed, and then they're really cool.
It was by the winter the duo recorded a very long demo tape, at least by industry standards, which featured a dozen songs. The pair were helped by organist Charlie Gillingham, as well as bassist Matt Malley and drummer Steve Bowman on the recording. Duritz told the Lennox Herald that neither him or Bryson really had any vision of doing anything with Counting Crows, but they just felt that their acoustic songs needed the full band treatment, so they enlisted some friends to help out. Duritz soon placed a call to a lawyer friend of his father's who referred him to another Los Angeles-based entertainment attorney, a guy named Alan Leonard. Leonard asked the duo to send him their demo tape, but it sat unlistened to for several weeks. Leonard, feeling some guilt, popped it into his tape player one day and remarked to the San Francisco Chronicle, "It was the single best demo tape I've ever heard in my life." It was around this time that Gary Gersh of Geffen Records, the man who famously signed Nirvana, heard about the tape from a friend of his wife. He got in touch with Leonard, who passed on the demo tape to him, and Gersh took it with him on a skiing vacation in Utah. He popped in that demo tape into his rented car at the airport and didn't listen to anything else for the whole trip. Later remarked to the San Francisco Chronicle, "I was nervous. I rarely fall in love with something that much." He soon jumped on a plane to catch the band's next gig in San Francisco at the Paradise Lounge. But he wasn't impressed with their performance. However, he still chose to meet the band the next day for breakfast and asked them if they had any acoustic versions of their songs in the demo tape. Then 2 weeks later, Gersh attended what was then called the Gavin Seminar. It was a conference for people in the radio industry. It was during that seminar Counting Crows were playing a showcase for local acts at a venue nearby called the I-Beam. Since their meeting with Gersh, the band now had a management team representing them, a company called Direct Management. The members of Direct Management witnessed that disappointing gig at the Paradise Lounge a few weeks prior, but they still wanted to represent the band, being huge fans of their demo tape. The showcase that Counting Crows played 2 weeks later was much better received than the Paradise Lounge gig, and in attendance at that gig were several record label executives. The next day, the band's management company was fielding calls from 9 different labels who were interested in signing Counting Crows. They eventually went with Geffen Records 2 months later, thanks to a promise to the band and their managers to let them participate in both the marketing and promotion plans for the group's albums. Counting Crows soon won another fan in San Francisco with radio legend Bonnie Simmons, who had played the group's demo tape on her weekly show on station KPFA. There was soon a bidding war amongst publishing companies, with Simmons even having her own small outfit, but ultimately EMI signed the group. Despite the disappointment though, Simmons sent the group's demo tape to her friend and legendary producer and musician T-Bone Burnett, who played with Bob Dylan. She had known the musician and producer for nearly 2 decades, and during that period she never once sent him a demo tape, so obviously when she sent him the tape he listened. The band also had another champion in Robbie Robertson of the group The Band, who served as an advisor to them during the time when they first signed to Geffen. Prior to recording their debut album, Gersh and Robertson suggested that the band rent a house in Los Angeles, live together, and bring in recording equipment, something they took him up on, renting a house in the Hollywood Hills. Gersh remarked to the San Francisco Chronicle that making records has a lot to do with the vibe of the place where they're being recorded. Duritz decorated the house with some of his paintings from his own home and an autographed picture of clown Emmett Kelly. Prior to hitting the recording studio, Robertson, who was also the musical director of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, suggested Counting Crows appear at the 1993 induction ceremony, standing in for no-show Van Morrison, which they did. They played one of his tunes that night, and they shared the stage with the members of Cream, Pearl Jam, and the surviving members of The Doors. The opportunity proved to be a mixed blessing. On one hand, it raised the band's profile, but it also came with never-ending comparisons to Van Morrison later on in their career, something we'll talk a little bit more about later on. It was the following month the band hit the studio to begin recording their debut record, August and everything after. But Counting Crows were unlike so many other bands signed to major labels. They didn't compromise, which of course sometimes left them at odds with their label. Duritz and his bandmates were big admirers of REM, not just for their music, but the way they managed their career, not making concessions. Duritz added to the Indianapolis Star. I remember being a kid and watching REM, and they just put their records out and toured and got people to listen to them. Because of that, people who were REM fans back then will be REM fans forever, and they keep getting more fans along the way. That's the way I want it to be for us. When the group's debut record was finished, Counting Crows insisted to their label Geffen that there would be no singles, no big budget marketing, so no ads in magazines or commercials, or even compiling the glowing reviews of the album. Instead, the idea was to have the album sell by word of mouth. Gersh by this point had left the label, taking a job with Capitol Records, but Duritz was still friends with him and stayed at his house when he visited Los Angeles. The label seemed to agree with the band's demands, but the bosses at Geffen insisted that Counting Crows were going to be marketed initially as classic rock, but the band vehemently disagreed with this approach, thinking they should instead be marketed to alternative rock radio. Counting Crows believed in this strategy so much they booked a tour with groups like the Cranberries and Suede early on in the promotion cycle for their first record to expose themselves to alternative rock audiences. Then, a few weeks before the album dropped in September of '93, Counting Crows appeared in Boulder, Colorado at a convention for adult alternative album radio program directors. At the time, adult alternative album radio, or AAA radio as it's called, a new format, was considered to be a grown-up version of underground radio, more open to honest music than pop stations. At least that's how the San Francisco Chronicle described it. At this convention, the band performed for every program director in attendance, representing all of America's AAA stations, and blew them away. A few weeks later, the album was in the hands of the AAA stations with no single. The album was left in the hands of program directors who pushed different songs in each of their markets. The early favorite was A Murder of One. The label soon serviced the whole album to both college radio and modern rock radio, and soon enough, Mr. Jones became a quick favorite, thanks to radio stations in Atlanta leading the charge, more specifically WKLS and WNNX, along with Georgia State University radio station WRAS. The band's label remarked that the success of Mr. Jones, first in Atlanta, showed that it could be a hit across multiple radio formats. By October of '93, the album debuted on the Heat Seekers chart, and by November, the label shot a video for the song. Geffen initially pitched the idea for the video to feature Duritz being a protege to a man who was traveling for work, but he rejected the idea. The band quickly garnered heavy airplay on MTV, becoming a buzz-bin clip. Then in December, the label issued Mr. Jones as a promotional single to both college and modern rock radio. Mr. Jones soon hit number 2 on the alternative airplay and mainstream rock tracks chart, and it was number 1 in Canada. As for who Mr. Jones is about, here's Duritz on Huffington Post explaining the inspiration behind the song.
Who's Marty Jones?
Our friend Marty. He used to be bass player in every band I was in until this one.
And what was special about him? Why did you feel like you had to write a song about him?
Well, I wrote a song about me. I just happened to be out with him that night. I mean, it's a song about two guys who are in a bar. I mean, we were in this bar. His father is one of the only Americans ever to make it as a flamenco guitar player in Spain.
Oh, wow.
David Serva. And he was in California playing with his old flamenco troupe in the Mission, and we'd gone to the show, and we were out with the flamenco troupe, and we were drunk in a bar. Chris Isaac's drummer, Kenny, was in the corner with like 3 girls. And we were just thinking...
Chris Isaac's drummer, very popular at this time.
Well, we were in a San Francisco band. They were, he was just
right.
a little bit older than us in San Francisco, and it just seemed like, we couldn't even manage to talk to girls, but if we were just thinking if we were rock stars, it'd be easier.
Right.
I went home and wrote the song. It's just,
And
The track Round Here hit number 7 and 11 on the same US charts. The album also had several other notable songs, including Rain King, Murder of One, and Anna Begins. 1994 proved to be a massive year for Counting Crows. The group appeared in the earlier part of the year on Saturday Night Live. 2 weeks after that appearance on SNL, their album shot from number 70 to 13 on the charts. It was the same month the band were now opening for the group Cracker, but crowds were coming to see Duritz's band instead, so Cracker frontman David Lowery asked Duritz to let his band open for the Crows at some point on a future tour. Later that year, the band opened 8 shows for the Rolling Stones, with Duritz even becoming a sort of sex symbol. The group also nabbed a major fan in David Letterman, who had the band on his late night show in early '94, where he sang the group's praises.
And this is their debut album here. It's entitled August and Everything After. And I'm telling you something, if you don't have a copy of this, there's something wrong with you. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome a great new band, Counting Crows.
By the spring of that year, Rolling Stone did a cover story on the band. The success of August and Everything After blew the band away. Duritz admitted to Rolling Stone that he initially envisioned that the record would maybe sell 100,000 copies if they were lucky, but it would go on to sell 7 million copies in the States and 10 million copies worldwide. The songs, which are deeply personal, connected with listeners so much so that Duritz told the Baltimore Sun he was fielding 2 to 3 phone calls a day from complete strangers wanting to talk about his music and his lyrics. It got to the point where he had to unlist his number. As for the message of the album, Duritz admits it's one of pessimism and not having roots, taking inspiration from his own upbringing, telling the Montreal Gazette, "That's what my songs are about, how alone people are and how hard it is to find a groove to set your life in, to find a place that's home." He added that the characters in his songs are people who are longing for something, so much so that when they do find what they're looking for, they can't stop longing for something else. In one interview, the band's label claimed that by the end of 1994, Counting Crows were the label's fastest selling artists since Nirvana. The members of the group were in their late 20s and early 30s by the time the band became successful. It was something Duritz was grateful for, admitting he likely wouldn't have handled success if it happened much earlier in his life. But the band did have to wrestle with one thing: the constant comparisons to classic rock acts, in addition to the never-ending comparisons to Van Morrison. It probably didn't help that they included Sha-La-La-La in Mr. Jones.
We used to sing
Duritz started to really detest the comparisons. He was, of course, a big Van Morrison fan, but he also admitted to the Baltimore Sun that he had 3,000 albums at home, therefore he had countless influences, and he saw more in common with groups like Earth, Wind & Fire and the Ohio Players than Van Morrison, adding, "I can see where I've learned a lot from Van, but for me, influences are a lot more about attitude you make towards your music than copying riffs." While the band had previously done some Van Morrison covers in concert, they stopped for a period of time, growing tired of the constant comparisons. In a separate interview, Duritz added that here he was pouring his heart and soul into the band's music, and he hated having one label his whole life. That does it for today's video, guys. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again on Rock and Roll True Stories. Take care.